A cold wind rustled through the vast fields of Ethan Carter's estate as he drove his truck along the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the early morning mist. He wasn't supposed to be here this early. His farmhands usually took care of the morning rounds, but something had pulled him out of bed today. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was just one of those unexplainable moments when life decides to throw something unexpected your way. As he rolled past the endless rows of wheat, something caught his eye. A small, unmoving shape nestled between the tall stalks. He slowed the truck, his brows furrowing in confusion. At first, he thought it was just an old sack of grain left behind, but as he stepped out and moved closer, his heart clenched. It wasn't a sack. It was a child, a girl, no older than 7 or 8, curled up on the cold, hard earth. Her tiny frame was wrapped in nothing but a thin, tattered sweater, and her bare feet were covered in dirt. She was shivering, her arms tightly hugging herself for warmth. Ethan crouched beside her, feeling a strange mix of concern and disbelief. How had she ended up here, alone, in the middle of his fields? "Hey," he said gently, shaking her shoulder. Her eyes fluttered open, wide and frightened, as she jerked away from his touch. "Whoa, easy," Ethan said, raising his hands. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The girl just stared at him, her lips trembling, but she didn't say a word. Ethan exhaled, realizing that whoever she was scared. And for good reason. It was obvious she hadn't just wandered here for fun. Someone had left her out here, or worse, she had run away from something. Glancing around, Ethan saw no sign of anyone else. No parents, no bags, nothing. Just a lost little girl in the middle of his land. His gut told him to call the authorities, but something about the way she looked at him, those big, wary eyes, made him hesitate. She didn't trust him. And if she didn't trust him, then maybe she had a reason not to trust anyone. "Are you hungry?" he asked after a moment. Her gaze flickered, the smallest nod barely visible. Ethan sighed. "All right, kid. Let's get you somewhere warm first." Carefully, he scooped her up in his arms, feeling just how light she was. Too light. As he carried her back to his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had brought her here, it wasn't good. And he had a sinking suspicion that taking her in was about to change his life in ways he never expected. As he drove back toward his farmhouse, the girl remained silent, staring out the window with a hollow expression. He wanted to ask her questions. Who she was, where she came from, why she was alone, but he knew better than to push. Because something told him that the truth, when it finally came out, was going to be far worse than he could imagine. Ethan drove in silence, stealing glances at the little girl curled up in the passenger seat. She was still shivering, her small fingers gripping the fabric of her sweater like it was the only thing holding her together. He wanted to say something, anything, to make her feel safe. But he knew trust wasn't earned with words. It was earned with time. The road to his farmhouse was bumpy, the old truck rattling with every dip and turn. Normally, he didn't think much of it, but tonight, every sound felt heavier, as if the weight of whatever had brought this child into his life was pressing down on him. When they finally reached the house, Ethan put the truck in park and turned to her. "Come on, let's get you inside." She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door like she was deciding whether or not to run. "I promise, no one's gonna hurt you," he said, keeping his voice steady. "You can leave any time you want, but at least come in, warm up, and get something to eat." After a long pause, she nodded. It was barely noticeable, but it was enough. Inside, the warmth of the farmhouse wrapped around them. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, and the soft glow of the kitchen light made the place feel safe, like a home should. Ethan grabbed a blanket from the couch and gently draped it over her shoulders. She didn't pull away this time. "What's your name?" he asked as he started heating up some soup. The girl stared at him for a moment before finally whispering, "Lena." Ethan turned, surprised she had answered. "Lena," he repeated. "That's a nice name." She didn't respond, just kept her eyes on the steaming bowl of soup as he placed it in front of her. He noticed the way she gripped the spoon, how she hesitated before taking a bite, like she wasn't used to being fed. "Where's your family, Lena?" he asked gently. She flinched, Not much, but enough for Ethan to know that was the wrong question to ask. You don't have to tell me anything right now, he said quickly, not wanting to scare her. Just eat, okay? For the first time, her expression softened. She took a small sip of the soup, then another, and before long, she was eating like she hadn't had a meal in days. Ethan leaned against the counter, watching her, his mind racing with questions. Who was this kid? Where had she come from? And why had she been alone, sleeping in his fields? That night, Ethan set up a spare room for Lena, tucking extra blankets onto the bed. But when he checked in on her later, she was curled up in the corner of the room instead, the blanket wrapped tightly around her. It was a habit, Ethan realized, one formed from sleeping in places where she had to protect herself. Something bad had happened to this girl, and whatever it wasn't over. The next morning, Ethan stepped outside to make a few calls. He had a friend, Officer Daniels, who worked at the local police station. If anyone had reported a missing child, Daniels would know, but as Ethan pulled out his phone, he noticed something strange. Tracks in the dirt, just beyond his porch. Footsteps. More than one set. His stomach tightened. Someone had been here, watching. And suddenly, Ethan knew one thing for sure. Whoever Lena was running from, they weren't far behind. Ethan's grip tightened around his phone as he stared at the footprints in the dirt. Someone had been here, watching, waiting. His gut told him it wasn't just some passerby. This had to do with Lena. He turned back toward the house, scanning the windows. She was still inside, safe for now. But he knew that might not last. Whoever was looking for her wasn't giving up. He had to act fast. Stepping inside, he found Lena sitting at the kitchen table, poking at a piece of toast. She looked up at him, sensing the tension in his face. What's wrong? Ethan hesitated, debating whether to tell her. But she had been on the run long enough. She deserved to know. I think someone was here last night, he said carefully. Did anyone follow you before you got to my farm? Her face went pale. She gripped the edge of the table, her small hands trembling. I don't know. I thought I lost them. Ethan crouched beside her. Lena, who are you running from? Tears welled in her eyes, but she forced herself to speak. They took my mom. Her voice was barely a whisper. I don't know where she is. We were hiding, but they found us. She told me to run. Ethan's heart pounded. This was bigger than he thought. This wasn't just a lost child. This was a mother and daughter trying to escape from someone dangerous. Who are they? He asked, keeping his voice calm. Lena shook her head. I don't know. Bad people. They came at night. They took her. And I just ran. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. He needed help. He couldn't handle this alone. Without hesitation, he grabbed his phone and called Officer Daniels. Daniels, I've got a situation, he said as soon as his friend picked up. I need you at my farm. Now. 20 minutes later, Officer Daniels pulled up in his patrol car. Ethan met him outside, filling him in quickly. Daniels nodded, his expression grim. I'll put out a search for her mother. But if someone's after this kid, we need to move fast. Just then, a noise came from the tree line, a rustling sound, quick and deliberate. Ethan's instincts kicked in. He turned just in time to see a shadow moving between the trees. Get Lena inside, Daniels ordered, drawing his weapon. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed Lena's hand and pulled her toward the house, slamming the door behind them. Her breathing was fast and shaky, fear written all over her face. Minutes passed. Then, a shout from outside. Ethan peeked through the window to see Daniels wrestling a man to the ground. A second officer had arrived, snapping cuffs onto the intruder's wrists. Ethan stepped out, Lena clutching his arm. Daniels looked up. This guy's got a record. Looks like he's connected to a trafficking ring. We're going to find her mother. Lena's grip on Ethan's arm tightened. They'll really find her? She whispered. Ethan looked down at her, his voice firm. Yes, and until then you're safe here. Days passed, and the investigation led to a breakthrough. Lena's mother was found in an abandoned warehouse, scared but alive. When she and Lena were finally reunited, the sight of them clinging to each other made Ethan's throat tighten as they prepared to leave for a safe shelter. Lena turned to Ethan. "Thank you," she said, her voice small but filled with gratitude. Ethan knelt, meeting her eyes. "You're always welcome here, kid." As the car drove away, Ethan stood on his porch, watching until they disappeared down the road. He had started that night thinking he was just offering a lost child a warm meal. But he had ended up saving a family, and maybe, in some way, they had saved him too.